Welcome to the debate. Tonight, we're tackling one of the most intellectually charged and, frankly, pretty emotionally exhausting issues in modern American politics: how we classify the core drivers behind the Donald Trump political movement. I mean, the sheer complexity of his public life, his rhetoric, his policy record, it really demands precision. So, our central question is this: is the Trump political phenomenon best categorized as fundamentally racist, or is it primarily nationalist?
Right, and that distinction is, well, it's everything, isn't it? Because how we label his movement fundamentally changes how we might, fight it, or even just how we understand the kind of threat it poses.
Exactly. So to frame this, we're defining nationalism pretty narrowly here. The whole America first posture, prioritizing the nation's economic interests, its identity, its sovereignty, often above global agreements. Racism, by contrast, well, that's the belief that some racial or ethnic groups are inherently superior or inferior. Now, I'll be arguing that the sort of actionable framework here is nationalism, focused on prioritizing American workers and sovereignty.
Okay, and I come at it from a different angle. I'm just not convinced that you can actually separate the two in this specific case. While the, let's say, stated policy framework might wave the nationalist flag, the rhetoric surrounding it and the actual application of those policies, they feel so fundamentally racialized that for me, the distinction becomes almost meaningless. I'd contend the phenomenon is really defined by its consistent pattern of ethnic exclusion, making it, racialized nationalism at best, and maybe even outright racism in practice.
Okay, I see why you think that, especially focusing on some of the highly charged language. But if we zoom out a bit, look at the actual policy levers he pulled. I think the story changes somewhat. Trump explicitly embraced the nationalist label. Remember that Houston rally in 2018? He defined his movement specifically against globalists and international agreements. His core focus, policy-wise, was border security, trade wars, controlling legal entry based on a perceived national benefit. These are, arguably standard positions any sovereign, self-interested nation might take. It's textbook nationalism, maybe just with rougher edges.
That's a compelling case for the policy structure. But how do you account for the language used to justify those national policies, when America First is consistently delivered using rhetoric that seems to view non-white, non-European groups as somehow polluting the national fabric? Well, then the movement isn't just about sovereignty, is it? I mean, when he referred to immigrants as poisoning the blood of our country, and that phrase just has such deep, dark historical resonance. That's not simply a debate about border security anymore. That is language used historically and now to frame specific ethnic groups as an existential, almost biological threat.
You're right to focus on that rhetoric. It was inflammatory. Look, I'm not defending that specific phrase. It was reckless, offensive, and yes, politically very clumsy. But here's the analytical challenge I'd put back to you. Does one or even, say, a handful of these inflammatory phrases define the entirety of the worldview? Or should we be looking at the broader pattern of policy engagement, acknowledging that, some of his language choices were maybe designed solely to provoke, to get a reaction?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that this is reducible to a few bad sentences designed to provoke. For me, it is unequivocally a pattern, and one that fundamentally changes the nature of the nationalism we're even discussing. Look, you have the sustained, years-long birther conspiracy against President Obama. That's textbook otherizing, aimed directly at questioning his American legitimacy based purely on racialized origin stories. Then telling the Congresswomen, the Squad, to go back to their countries of origin, even though they're American citizens. And then, of course, the shithole countries comment regarding nations predominantly in Africa and Latin America. It's a lot.
Okay, wait a second. That is a consistent list of inflammatory remarks, I grant you that. But let's try to frame the intent just slightly differently for a moment. Take the birther conspiracy. Problematic? Absolutely. But he also targeted Ted Cruz's citizenship during the 2016 primaries. Now, Cruz is Cuban-American, not the same racial profile as Obama. Yet that was still deemed fair game for these citizenship attacks. So was the mechanism strictly racial animus against a black president? Or was it maybe a broader political opportunism, just using citizenship as a weapon against anyone who got in his way?
I'd argue the intensity and the sheer depth of the Obama attacks were qualitatively different, centered on a specific fantasy of foreignness that absolutely plays into racist tropes. And honestly, if we're talking patterns, we just cannot ignore the Central Park Five.
Yes, the Central Park Five. That is probably the most difficult thing to reconcile for anyone who wants to see him as purely a transactional nationalist. It really is.
Exactly. And 1989, he takes out those full-page ads calling for the death penalty. Okay, I grant you the social context of 1989 New York was different. Fear, crime, these were massive factors. But here's the core issue for me. He still defends those ads, even today, long after DNA evidence completely exonerated those 5 Black and Latino men. Maintaining their guilt against overwhelming evidence, that's not just stubborn pride. It feels like a fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge the dignity and humanity of those particular Black and Latino lives.
Well, I'm not entirely convinced that stubborn pride and racial animus are mutually exclusive concepts, but I absolutely agree that the effect of that continued defense, perpetuating harm, stigmatizing innocent people, that is the ultimate political sin here. You're right, the impact matters far more than whatever supposed intent is locked inside his head.
Agreed. The impact has to be the metric that matters most.
Okay, but let's look at some competing evidence, though, because the governance record, I think, complicates the idea that he's, a committed white supremacist or just a pure racist. If the movement is only defined by racism, how do you account for significant non-racial policy victories? He signed the First Step Act. That was a massive criminal justice reform bill disproportionately benefiting Black Americans seeking release. He appointed Ben Carson to his cabinet. Pre-COVID, we saw historically low unemployment numbers for Black and Hispanic Americans. These are results that, they don't fit neatly into a strictly racist agenda narrative.
That frankly sounds a bit like the classic political, I have Black friends, therefore I cannot be racist defense, just applied to policy actions. Those appointments, those reforms, they often resulted from political calculation, didn't they? The First Step Act, for instance, had huge conservative policy momentum behind it already. I would argue that his governing style is fundamentally transactional, not ideologically anti-racist. He seems willing to sign a bill that helps Black Americans if it furthers his political standing or his broader legislative agenda.
But isn't that exactly my point about nationalism versus racism? If the governing priority is America first, then the needs of American citizens, which includes Black and Hispanic workers, can occasionally align with the nationalist agenda, even if his surrounding rhetoric is racially tinged. The policy priority in that view is the nation state, not explicitly white supremacy.
Okay, but this brings us right back to what I'd call racialized nationalism. Because the policy isn't really colorblind if the rhetoric used to justify it is constantly defining who's in and who's out based on ethnicity or origin. When he talks about making America great again, the vision he evokes seems clearly rooted in a less diverse, kind of post-war 1950s nostalgia. His nationalism effectively defines who the real Americans are, and pretty much everyone else, immigrants, Muslims, globalists, people from those quote-unquote shithole countries, is systematically othered.
That's a sharp definition, but is that truly about race, fundamentally? Or are we maybe confusing race with culture, or assimilation, legal status, maybe language barriers? Isn't it just possibly a very hard-line stance on legal immigration and assimilation?
But that blurring of lines is the mechanism of the racialization. Let's go back to Judge Carril. Trump claimed Carril couldn't be fair solely because he was Mexican. But Judge Carril was born in Indiana, an American citizen. Trump was actively erasing the distinction between American citizenship, legal status, and ethnic identity, declaring him essentially foreign because of his heritage.
Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House at the time, even said that was, and I quote, the textbook definition of a racist comment.
Wow. Okay, that is a powerful piece of evidence because it really demonstrates that the target seems to be ethnic identity itself, not just legal status or something else.
Precisely. His brand of nationalism consistently relies on this kind of ethnic exclusion, demonstrating an understanding of American identity that feels very white-coded, regardless of his stated policy goals on, say, trade or foreign policy.
I appreciate that clarification. It really forces us to acknowledge this historical tension that has, frankly, always existed in American nationalism. We've always had these two competing traditions, right? The inclusive civic nationalism, where anyone, regardless of background, can theoretically assimilate into shared democratic values, and then the exclusive ethnic nationalism. Which tradition, based on this pattern of rhetoric we've discussed, does it seem Trump is channeling?
Well, based on the evidence, I think it's overwhelming. He's channeling the exclusive ethnic nationalism tradition. The Muslim travel ban, the extreme focus on building the wall, the attacks on birthright citizenship, these things echo the same spirit that drove, say, the Know Nothing Party in the 19th century or the original America First Committee before World War II. It consistently targets whoever is perceived as the threatening other at that particular moment in time.
And this leads us to the grim, kind of unavoidable fact that we have to confront. His rhetoric isn't just perceived as racialized by critics. It's actively embraced by the most extreme white nationalist groups. The Daily Stormer, an explicitly white nationalist publication, called his election and rhetoric the kind of white nationalism we elected him for. That is incredibly uncomfortable to acknowledge, and it really can't be just dismissed as mere political clumsiness or provocation.
Absolutely not. And this raises that really difficult question of culpability. Is Trump genuinely expressing these racialized beliefs himself, or is he perhaps cynically exploiting racial fears purely for political gain? And maybe which one is actually worse?
You know, I actually lean towards the cynical exploitation being morally worse. If he truly believes it, well, he's operating under a certain warped worldview. But if he's cynically exploiting it, that means he understands the division, he understands the harm he's causing, and he considers that harm an acceptable, maybe even desirable price for gaining power and achieving his nationalist policy goals. It feels like calculated cruelty.
I tend to agree. Regardless of the internal motivation, whether it's conscious belief or cynical exploitation, the practical effect is the same. His rhetoric and policies have undeniably normalized racial resentment and emboldened white nationalist movements. We've seen the data on increased hate crimes that corresponds with his rise. The impact is clear. He has effectively weaponized ethnic division in the service of his particular brand of political nationalism.
So as we wrap up, I think we've definitely complicated the original question significantly. It seems we have to shift the focus away from trying to figure out what's truly in Trump's heart, his personal intent, and instead analyze his impact and the inherent nature of the movement he built. His desire to fulfill a nationalist agenda seems to exist simultaneously with, and maybe is even fueled by, the perpetuation of harm to minority communities through this consistent ethnic targeting. It seems you really can't just peel the two apart cleanly.
Yeah, I would conclude that the distinction between classifying this phenomenon as purely racist or purely nationalist is, at the end of the day, maybe academic. The weight of the evidence points to Trump being an ethnic nationalist. His vision of America is fundamentally exclusionary in practice. And that version of nationalism, one that defines itself largely by who it keeps out, is simply incompatible with the inclusive, civic American founding ideals of equality and justice for all.
And this analysis is significant, I think, because it's not just about putting a label on an ideology. It's really about confronting the normalization of dehumanizing rhetoric within our political discourse. Reversing that damage requires more than just policy changes. It requires consciously choosing better rhetoric, affirming our common humanity, especially when our policy disagreements are sharpest.
And that really is the foundation of democracy, isn't it? It depends entirely on our ability to see fellow citizens with dignity and respect, even when we disagree profoundly. Any leader who continuously undermines that foundation through racialized resentment or exclusionary politics is, almost by definition, undermining the very system they claim to be leading.
Which is exactly why these uncomfortable conversations like the one we've had tonight are so necessary. They are, hopefully, part of the path toward understanding the true, often dual, nature of the challenges we face.